Hello, Booktube. Today, an improvised read along that I am starting as of now. This is the Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. This is probably the magnum opus of these two writers. Not my favorite book from them, but their magnum opus, the most important book that they wrote as a writing partnership. In a very relevant book in the history of philosophy. I have decided to reread this book because I don't think that I fully understood the whole book. I helped myself a lot through lectures, and because of that, I can remember still sort of like the overarching argument. But I think it's a good moment to reread this book because it's relevant to what I'm studying at the moment and to what I'm writing as well. Aside from my duties, I'm also writing a book, co-writing a book with my partner, and we are both reading this book together. So maybe at some point she will also show up here and we'll talk about it together. But I just wanted to make an announcement video about me starting this book. I'm gonna be doing a read along. I don't know how long it will take. I don't want to commit to any specific dates. As you know, my presence in the channel is very unpredictable, but I can guarantee that this will not take anywhere nearly as long as the other two read-alongs that I've done in this channel. I did one read-along with Another Bibliophile Reads, which was for the Foundation trilogy from Isaac Asimov, and another read-along for The Name of the Rose with Randy Ray. And they both went a bit strepitously bad, in the sense of like the read-alongs taking longer than they were expected for reasons beyond our control. But in this case, this is philosophy. This is my realm. This is I approach the reading of philosophy very differently from the reading of anything else, and not because I see it as a duty or anything. Just I don't know. But I tend to be more disciplined when I read philosophy because the subject requires it for me. It's not so easy to understand. You have to actually sit down and write just as much as you are reading in order to really get anything from the books sometimes. And this is one of those cases. Adorno never wrote anything easy, but he also never wrote anything that was not worth reading or that was not nuanced in one way or another. As you know, I'm a big fan of Adorno as a philosopher, and I think that he is nowhere nearly talked about enough. I suspect it's because he's a quite hard writer, and one that you arrive to after a long journey going through all the other philosophers that you tend to come across more often. Also, critical theory doesn't have a really good name. It's now on trend reading critical theory, and Adorno is considered to be sort of like one of the founding figures of that school of writing or thought or whatever. But I still don't come, at least within my university environment, and I don't come across a lot of people who has read Adorno. I am not pronouncing myself as a knower or understander or teacher or anything like that. I'm a student, and I'm not even a student. I barely assist to classes. I I barely do the readings that I'm assigned. I tend to do my own readings and then somehow manage to fit them in the narratives required for my assessments, so that I don't have to follow anyone else's schemes. Which means that I will be reading this along. I will be trying to explain what I can understand from it. It might be helpful to some people, but I am very sure that I'm going to be misreading many of the things here. I feel like interpretation is no other thing that misreading. Misinterpretation is the same thing as interpretation, because there is no right or wrong interpretation. There is definitely more plausible and less plausible interpretations. But mine is going to be that of a very inexperienced reader of philosophy and writer. Without further ado, let's get into the introduction. I read the introduction day before yesterday, and I made some notes. I remember a couple of things about this book. I do like. I recommend also, by the way, verse editions. I think they're very good for this kind of philosophical works because I find them very, very resistant. They don't tend to break down in my hands like Penguin paperbacks do. I remember one thing about this book, and it's its overarching conclusion. And that is the one sort of premise or assumption that I came in to the book before opening it. And that is that this book aims to demonstrate that in the Enlightenment something happened. Something that was very much against any assumption or desire within the Enlightenment project. And that is the Enlightenment is the process or the project of freeing humans from all myths and enchantment. It's supposed to be the moment of disenchantment. Partially, Nietzsche says that God is dead because he believes that it was part of him, at least, was killed during the Enlightenment. God, as a metaphor for the divine, for enchantment in general, as you will. But the truth is that in Adorno's view, the Enlightenment did not get rid of any myth. They just changed one myth for another. The myth of God was changed for the myth that we can get rid of all myths. The myth of human progress, basically, was the new myth. And there are certain consequences to that. Adorno, at some point in this book, will argue that one of the consequences of that was the upcoming waves of fascism and ultranationalism that derived in Auschwitz. So that is a very bold claim that we will probably have to talk about at some point here. Adorno believes that the Enlightenment was the first domino piece that led directly towards the two world wars that happened and everything that involves them, and many other genocides. He, in the introduction, starts talking about how they began to explore. They were doing a research on something else, and suddenly they realized it turned out, in fact, that we had set ourselves nothing less than the discovery of why mankind, instead of entering into a truly human condition, is sinking into a new kind of barbarism. So instead of achieving what the Enlightenment was sort of like trying to achieve, is actually regressing. So instead of progress, we have regression. So one question that clearly is arising from the very first paragraph of this book is why are we becoming more inhuman? Why regressing instead of progress? Here Adorno is also talking to Hegel. The Hegelian realization of the spirit, the full spirit, is another iteration of this same dream of the human zenith, the peak of the Enlightenment project, being realized someday at the end of history. But in Adorno's conclusion to his research, very much the opposite seems to be happening. Going into the next page, well, actually from the bottom of here, they go into talking. The indefatigable self-destructiveness of the Enlightenment requires philosophy to discard even the last vestiges of innocence in regard to the habits and tendencies of the spirit of the age. When public opinion has reached a state in which thought inevitably becomes a commodity, and language the means of promoting that commodity, then the attempt to trace the course of such a depravation has to deny any allegiance to current linguistic and conceptual conventions, lest their world historical consequences thwart it entirely. So basically what this is saying, this is based, of course, in some of Adorno's previous writings and Horkheimer's. But basically what this is saying is that thought has become a commodity, which is to say thought has become another tool or mechanism serving the system, the capitalistic system of endless reproduction, which means that language, thought, if it is in any way attached or connected to the present time, cannot be trusted, because it has already been instrumentalized to sustain that system. It continues. Yeah. Okay, I'm just gonna skip because otherwise this video is gonna take 2 hours. I just realized that it's only 3 pages, but if I actually laid out all my thoughts, this is only a first impressions kind of video. So I'm gonna move forward. So yeah, history has been prostituted. I'm just gonna shoot claims at you. Criticism is already trapped in this instrumentalization because criticism uses language and tends to use the same affects and mechanisms that are at play in the present. And here you have it again summarized in a really nice way. The conclusion of what I'm about to read is that language serves ideology. There is no longer any available form of linguistic expression which has not tended toward accommodation to dominant currents of thought. And what a devalued language does not do automatically is proficiently executed by societal mechanisms. If we continue to read on the next page, this is page, in Roman numbers, page 8, for anyone who has the book and is going through it as well. Believing that without a strict limitation to the verification of facts and probability theory, the cognitive spirit would prove all too susceptible to charlatanism being basically like jargon, and superstition. It makes a parched ground ready and avid for charlatanism and superstition, just as prohibition has always offered access to the poisonous product, so the obstruction of the theoretical faculty paved the way for political error and madness. Continues with the same argument that we were talking about before, and now we have an outlining of the whole book. So this is a good moment. No, it doesn't start here yet. This is just the dilemma. Okay, before, by the end of the introduction, you can expect to have a really good idea of what the book is going to be about and whether or not you want to follow this read along. The dilemma that faced us in our work proved to be the first phenomenon for investigation, the self-destruction of the Enlightenment. We are wholly convinced, and this is very important because this is a premise to the book, and therein lies our petitio principle, basically, that social freedom is inseparable from enlightened thought. And that seems a very enlightened affirmation. Doesn't seem like they are in conflict with the main principle of the Enlightenment, right? But that conviction has a certain problems, and they also acknowledge those problems. Further down, they say, it already contains the seed of the reversal universally apparent today. If consideration of the destructive aspect of progress is left to its enemies, blindly pragmatized thought loses its transcending quality and its relation to truth. In the enigmatic readiness of the technologically educated masses to fall under the sway of any despotism, in its self-destructive affinity to popular paranoia, and in all uncomprehended absurdity, the weakness of the modern theoretical faculty is apparent. So this is basically the evidence that they find in such a consideration. Now follows, and this is sort of this paragraph is very important because it outlines the very much the thesis of the whole book, the one that I was talking about before. I wrote here FAB, not to forget. We believe that these fragments will contribute to the health of that theoretical understanding, so far as we show that the prime cause of, the retreat from enlightenment into mythology is not to be sought so much in the nationalism, pagan, and other mythologies manufactured precisely in order to contrive such a reversal, but in the enlightenment in itself, when paralyzed by fear of the truth. So here we find that the fear of truth is in some ways that articulates the parallelization that makes the Enlightenment regress into myth, go back, escape towards myth again in a different way, of course, because it has to convince itself of being doing the opposite. But there you go. Furthermore, so and then the next page is basically saying that outlining the two main characteristics, which are like false clarity and a fear of deviation, which are sort of like the main factors that mislead the Enlightenment into its wrong conclusions. But false clarity for Adorno and Horkheimer is just another name for myth. So whenever the Enlightenment is being misled into its absolutist conclusions, it's really just escaping into myth. Okay, I'll read this long paragraph because it has it's full of reference. It's just an interesting paragraph. It goes, the fallen nature, and this fallen might refer to Genesis or might refer to might be referring to Genesis, but it might as well be referring to Heidegger. Heidegger also uses the word fallen to refer to Dasein, which is the ontological being with which he tries to explain the human condition, but not necessarily equated to human. The interesting thing about Dasein is that its translation is being there. So any being there, any being in the world could be Dasein. It conceives the possibility of non-human animals, for example, to be Daseins. But that is from a different book. So the fallen nature of modern man cannot be separated from social progress. On the one hand, the growth of economic productivity furnishes the conditions for a world of greater justice. On the other hand, it allows the technical apparatus and the social groups which administer it a disproportionate superiority to the rest of the population. The individual is wholly devalued in relation to the economic powers, which at the same time press the control of society over nature to hitherto unsuspected heights. Even though the individual disappears before the apparatus which he serves, that apparatus provides him, as never before, in an unjust state of life. The impotence and pliability of the masses grow with the quantitative increase in commodities allowed them. That paragraph contains like very much many of Adorno's theses on the culture industry, on the devaluation of objects, because sort of like the numeric value of things is attached. This is also Marx, but the numeric value of things attached to them, which is a quantitative value, distorts the potential qualitative value that those things could have. This also applies to the people trapped in this system. And I think that is where Adorno is trying to go when he says an unjust state of life. The flood of detailed information and candy floss entertainment simultaneously instructs and stultifies mankind. Here is basically just talking about over-information. This is something very familiar to all of us. We are overwhelmed. There is a scene in Whatever Works from Woody Allen where he, like the very first scene, where he looks at the camera and it's like, how am I to care? You know, the horror, referring also to Joseph Conrad. This is so much of it that we can just not process it. We are overwhelmed by it, and therefore we go from deep care to complete indifference, which is a defense mechanism for this system. The task to be accomplished is not the conservation of the past, but the redemption of the hopes of the past. That is the task of this book. Okay, there is a bit more talking about surplus production, and then it goes into talking about the starting point. Yes, so I'm gonna talk about this. So this is sort of like now we are in like level 0 of the book, which is talking about the premise more than anything else, which is under existing conditions, the gifts of fortune themselves become elements of misfortune. Their quantity in default of a social subject operated during the internal economic crisis of times past as so-called surplus production. Today, because of the enthronement of power groups as that social subject, it produces the international threat of fascism. Progress becomes regression. The hygienic shop floor and everything that goes with it. The people's car or the sports drone leads to an insensitive liquidation of metaphysics. Metaphysics, the study of being, which is not the same as ontology but similar, would be irrelevant. But that in the social whole they themselves become metaphysics, an ideological curtain behind which the real evil is concentrated, is not irrelevant. This is the starting point of our deliberations. And now we finally, on the last page, have an outline of the core arguments of this book, of the structure and everything, so I'm very much going to read all of it. And with that, you should have enough information to know if you're interested or not. I'm pretty sure I'll do the read along anyways, because if I were reading this book and I could find another student who was like going through it, reading closely and taking the risk of making claims, although they might be wrong, and therefore allowing for interaction and correction, I would actually probably had understood it the first time I read it.